I think if we want to make capitalism sustainable, you have to imbue it with concepts of fairness and care, and the only way you can really do that is through government intervention, which is obviously a politically contentious point.
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and today we have a thought-provoking episode featuring a return guest, Nate Murphy. Nate is an advocate for minimalism, environmental consciousness, and co-living, and he's here to share his insights on how these concepts intersect with van life and tiny house living. We'll also explore his book, The Ideas That Rule Us, which dives deep into the ideologies shaping our lives and how embracing minimalism can lead to more fulfilling choices. Nate's personal journey and the practical steps he offers for aligning your life with your values are truly inspiring. So if you've ever felt weighed down by consumerism or are curious about making radical lifestyle changes, this episode is a must listen. Stay tuned as we uncover the benefits of eco-villages, the freedom of van life, and pathways to a more self-aware and community-focused existence. The Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast is sponsored by Precision Temp hot water heaters. I recently sat down with Jenna from the amazing YouTube channel Tiny House Giant Journey. Jenna built her tiny house in 2014 and has been using Precision Temp hot water heaters since the beginning.
So whenever somebody asks me for a recommendation for a water heater for a tiny house, I always recommend Precision Temp tankless hot water heater because that's what I've used. I've had it for 10 years and I have loved the unit. I love how quickly it heats up. I love how it works in cold weather and high altitudes. And I love that they have really great customer service. So I definitely always recommend that unit whenever somebody asks.
Right now, Precision Temp is offering $50 off their amazing hot water heaters if you use the code THLP at checkout. Head over to Precision Temp, that's PRECISIONTEMP.com, and use the coupon code THLP for $50 off.
I think their customer service is really great. If they're, too busy or after hours, they get back to me really quickly. So I've definitely experienced other hot water heaters. I definitely would always go with a tankless hot water heater. And the Precision Temp, because it's so compact, it can fit underneath my sink in my tiny house and it vents through the floor. So it just looks nice to me and it's quiet. I love that.
Once again, Precision Temp is offering $50 off when you use the coupon code THLP at checkout. Head over to Precision Temp, that's PRECISIONTEMP.com, and use the coupon code THLP for $50 off. Thank you so much to Precision Temp for sponsoring our show. All right, I am here with Nathan Murphy. Nathan is currently the founder and lead researcher at Prepolitica, a research group that takes a science-first approach for the development of political theory. In the past, Nathan has invented, patented, and sold medical products, lobbied the highest levels of government for prison reform, founded 3 technology businesses, been a sponsored rock climber, built a large social media following, sold tens of thousands of books, created online courses, renovated a dilapidated house, DIY, and over the past 5 years, he has been working in political theory, writing academic papers, and presenting at conferences. Nathan Murphy's new book, The Ideas That Rule Us, explores the profound impact that societal ideas and ideologies have on our personal lives, choices, and well-being. Murphy delves into how these often unexamined beliefs shape our reality, influencing everything from the way we live to the structures of our communities. Nate actually was on the show maybe about a year ago to talk about van life guide and renovating a dilapidated house in Spain. But I'm excited to have you back on to talk about the book. Welcome back to the show, Nate.
Well, thank you, Ethan. Thank you for having me back. This is the first time I've been on a podcast twice, and it's kind of interesting. It's going to be quite different subject matters.
Yes.
Both really interesting. But yeah, interesting to see your thoughts on the latest.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed our first interview, and I'll put a link to it for those who maybe haven't heard it. And I felt like there was a very strong kind of philosophical backbone to everything that you were doing. So I'm glad to see you kind of flesh it out into this book. So I think I want to start just with, in the book you discuss how consumerism drives our personal choices. So I was curious if you could share an example of how adopting a minimalist ideology, such as through, van life or tiny house living, can lead to more fulfilling life choices.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question. I think when we look at consumerism and how consumerism, if we're looking at it from an ideological perspective, how it is quite deeply embedded in our culture and affects our desires and therefore our behaviors and the things we do to move towards the idea, the desires that we have. It comes up with a lot of sort of problematic ideas, and potentially one of the biggest one is, without stuff, we're not valuable. Like, we use belongings or items as signifiers of wealth or success or personal worth or personal validation through the eyes of others, and that kind of traps us into this cycle of purchasing or working towards purchasing objects which ultimately aren't going to fulfill us. And I think that's largely the problem. So I think when people look at consumerism and they try to reject some of these core tenets of the ideological structure that drives it, they look towards things like, minimalism is one of them. And by recalibrating what you're working towards is not more stuff, it's not a bigger house, it's not this fancy car, it's not a 30 grand watch. It's okay, what do I want to be able to live the life that I want to live, and how do I get there in the most effective way? And minimalism is like a great conduit and a great vehicle to take you there. But to do that isn't necessarily easy, because you have to start to let go of some of the concepts which might be quite deeply embedded within us through our childhood, for our socialization. The idea is that we need to have these things to be valuable, and they've got to be new things, and they've got to be big, and they've got to be comparable to other people. So I think moving towards minimalism, part of it is an ideological deconstruction of the ideas that we hold. And then once we're sort of free of those, then we can embrace different ways of living.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to me, having interviewed, 300 plus people for this show, that, some people come to van life or tiny house living because they are minimalists, and others become minimalists after they, start living tiny or start doing van life. It kind of forces you more or less into minimalism just because of the physical constraints of the space.
Yeah. I can totally see that. I think, I mean, if you're coming into van life because you're a minimalist, that means that you've gone through that journey somehow already.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite hard if you've got a big house, an apartment, and you've got all the things. It can be quite hard to make that move to a van or to tiny living without. Yeah, that makes sense.
So you mentioned the emotional toll of conforming to these society norms when they don't align with your personal values. What are some of the emotional challenges that people face when breaking free from these norms like consumerism? And how do you overcome that?
Yeah. So I think when people, but basically everyone's affected by the ideas that we grow up with. That's just a fact of living in society. So when you want to change, or you find reason to change from the ideas that you're brought up with, you're going to come across all sorts of different forms of resistance. But firstly, there's the resistance of your self-identity. Maybe you identify as someone who has these things or will have these things. Someone who is like wealthy and can afford all the consumerist trappings, and that might be hard to overcome. Then the other one is the social ones, because there's a constant stream of from advertising, from social media, from TV and film, which is kind of curating the ideas that we live by. And to change away from that, that's a constant draw, something we always have to be kind of mindful of and push back on, because it's very easy to slip back into kind of like a previous way of thinking, or a very consumerist way of thinking, where if I have these things, I will be better. and then obviously thirdly, then there's your actual social environment. If you start acting in a way which is completely different from your social environment, the people you're around, the people you've grown up with, or your family, then it can appear to be a judgment on their value systems or the things that they buy into, and that can be difficult to counterbalance, because if you do something which is contrary to how other people live their lives, immediately people can be defensive or offensive because they just can't understand it, and the fact that you're doing something different is kind of implicitly a criticism of them, and people
Yeah.
struggle to deal with that quite often.
Yeah. I mean, I think that people are really sensitive to the social pressures of kind of keeping up with or conforming to the way that their friends and family are living. And I know that in a way you can become ostracized. You know, people, there's almost like a pecking order, or there's a tendency to want to criticize friends or family for, you know, doing something different, such as deciding to live tiny, or doing van life, or just becoming a minimalist in their current living situations.
Yeah, and I think we have to, like, if you're in a situation where you've made this change into any different area of in any area of your life, you've made a change in your lifestyle, and you come across people who are kind of like slightly aggressive about just the way you want to live your life, even though it doesn't actually affect them in any way whatsoever.
Right.
I think you can just sort of take pause. You can notice people's behavior, and you're making this choice, and some people just won't like it, and you just have to recognize it's not actually to do with you; it's to do with them. They're struggling with the challenge you're making to the way they live their life, and people don't like that. There's a lot of people will find this in many areas. So people who sort of go vegetarian when they're surrounded by people who eat meat, they kind of, you often get this aggressive pushback, and it's nothing to do with you. It's nothing to do with your lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
It's to do with how you're implicitly challenging what they do and how they think, and people don't like it because if your self-concept and how you see yourself is made up of ideas, essentially, and if one of these ideas is, you know, that you're the guy, you've got the big house, you've got the car, you've got the luxury objects, and someone's rejecting all of that, then you're challenging the ideas that form their self-concept, and implicitly in that same time space, you're challenging them as a person, and that's what people struggle with.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, is it up to us to soften the blow for them, or is it up to us to, you know, essentially continue to be who we are and kind of let them deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you recognize that their self-concept, or that, you know, this ego sort of thing is hurting in some way, when based on your challenge or your rejection to their concepts, and what the concepts that make them who they feel they are, I think you can treat that with a bit of kindness, and maybe the best is some light humor, or self-depreciating humor. You know, you say, well, I'm going to be tiny and live here, so I'm just too poor. You know, I can't afford a giant house, so I'm going to go small. I'm going to, you know, and you can find a way which makes them still feel good about themselves, even though you're challenging like these foundational concepts of their being. I like, depends who they are, depends on your relationship with them. Sometimes it's worth challenging, sometimes it's just not. And you can just let them see how it plays out. I think that's probably the best thing. I've you know, when I left the city, and then I was traveling, and then I bought a van. I was living in a van for a few years, and I think some people in my social environment were probably like, this guy's like a totally weird hippie, you know. They just didn't get it. But then, you know, when a few years, actually now I'm 9 years down the road from that journey, and people look at my lifestyle and like, well, I'm basically totally free. I've got remote business. I live in a beautiful house in the mountains. My life is my own, and people have a different viewpoint. They see it in a different way now, and that to me is the easiest way to argue. It's basically kind of not argue and just go down that road, and, you know, perhaps you're debt free and they're still slaving under a giant mortgage, and you're happy. You have more freedom of your time. You've got better, you know, more money to invest in your children or whatever it is. I think the easiest way is to confront that down the road with reality of example.
Nice. So in the book, you talk about how capitalist ideologies promote kind of short-term gains over long-term sustainability, and
Mhm.
you kind of propose a shift towards a more ecologically sustainable ideology to kind of transform our relationship with consumption and waste. And so I'm curious, like, how do you think the shift from a capitalist ideology to a more sustainable one can transform that approach to consumption and waste?
So, firstly, I would say that the way I see capitalism is it's fundamentally a system of economic cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
And we're a very cooperative species, and capitalism works very well. It works very well in this way.
Yeah.
It's lifted, hundreds of million people out of really horrible life conditions and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm definitely not an anti-capitalist
Right.
under that banner. But what is lacking in capitalism is concepts of fairness and care, which are also fundamentally human preferences. And when we look at capitalism, it doesn't intrinsically have these properties. It's definitely not intrinsically caring, and it's definitely not intrinsically fair because you need capital to pay. So,
Yeah.
and then when we're looking at care, then it depends on who we're caring for. So there's care within our community, then there's a global perspective of caring for people from other nations, but there's also the perspective of the environment as well. So I think if we want to make capitalism sustainable, you have to imbue it with concepts of fairness
Mm-hmm.
and care. And the only
Mm-hmm.
way you can really do that is through government intervention, which is obviously a politically contentious point. But we can see it in a lot of societies where capital has like too much influence over the government, and when it can do that, it remodels the government within its image, which is essentially you need capital to play.
Mm-hmm.
And then, for example, in the US, you have these elections with vast sums of money and limited political donations, and then you end up with a dysfunctional political system, and eventually you end up with the disintegration of a true capitalist system because it becomes corrupted by capital, corrupted by government, and so on. So, coming back to your question of the environment, at the same time, if we want to have a capitalist system that cares for the planet that we live in, then we also need to be thinking about how the government can effectively manage that or help regulate or constrain capitalism in such a way that it does actually care for things other than only profit.
Yeah. You can see how everything is connected together. You made the point about the political system, especially in the United States, and I just as you were talking, I just thought about how much physical waste that whole cycle leads to. Not to mention just how exhausting it is emotionally as somebody who lives in the United States to have an election with that much money and that much kind of media focused on it for so many months beforehand, but also just all the yard signs, all the all the crap that gets made for it with all that money. Just it's all made for this one thing, this one day, and then afterwards it's just completely valueless.
Yeah. It's a horrific amount of money. I think there's one of the stats in my book is looking at how capitalism remodels governments when it's unrestricted or unconstrained. And I think Germany's, for the election of their chancellor, the whole budget for that entire campaign, which is like the main, it's like the president in the US, the whole campaign for that, the budget was less for like one senator in Colorado. So the money in politics, I mean, you can thank Citizens United ruling pretty much for that. It's gross and it's corrupting. It's obviously corrupting. People don't pay hundreds of millions of dollars not to have influence, and the influence comes at the cost of everyone else.
Well, a lot of the things that we're talking about, and my next question is kind of about eco villages and co-living spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Many of these concepts and ideas that you introduce in the book are ideas that didn't originate in the tiny house movement, but have certainly taken hold in the tiny house movement. Minimalism, environmental consciousness, co-living, eco communities. I'm curious how you came to these concepts. Was it through your experience doing the van life thing? Or, so it's like, did you get introduced to this through van life, or were you already kind of here and van life fit in nicely with where you were going?
So, I mean, I don't think my moving towards van life wasn't really a philosophical drive. I
Yeah.
wanted the cheapest way to go climbing for the longest period of time. So
There you go.
it's not
Okay.
very exciting in that perspective. But I think in terms of the co-living community, I think what came for me to realize that the importance of this, especially in relation to consumerism, is trying to look at the ideological opposite of consumerism. And a lot of people would say, well, okay, it's like minimalism. It's part of it potentially, but really, actually, the opposite of consumerism is contributionism. It's like you through contribution you gain value rather than through owning things or
Yeah.
buying things. You
Yeah.
gain value in your community, and I think consumerism because it leads us to have this idea that we can buy anything and have everything ourselves, and that reduces how we feel dependent or reduces our actual dependence on anyone else because
Yeah.
everything can be purchased, everything can be bought. We can feel like we did everything ourselves, and that leads us to feel like community is not that important.
Yeah.
But in fact, actually, generally, we're as people, we're happier, we're better off when we do things. We contribute to our community. People love us for our contribution. That makes us want to do more, and it just makes our lives better and our community better. Whereas the consumer experience of buying something, people might think you're cool for an instant, but they don't care. They just don't care about it. In reality, they might appear like they care for a minute, but no one cares if you've got a fancy car.
Right.
They just don't. It's like most things, but they do care if you do something cool for them, or if you help people. These things that move people, and that's what makes you valuable. That's what gives you worth.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of a nice dovetail into this. What are some of the benefits of eco villages and co-living spaces, and how do they contrast with, the current housing model, especially in the United States, which is, single family homes?
Well, I mean, I think as soon as you have people living, if you have communities of tiny homes or something like this, you end up with closer, more dependency on people around you. And I think that implicitly you're going to end up with a more like a village sort of a scenario where kind of you sort of know everyone, and hopefully you get on with everyone. But in a general sense, you end up with more community. For example, I know a lot of people who live in a city and they've lived next door to someone in an apartment block, and they basically never spoke to the person who's a direct neighbor for years. And that potentially this sort of, I mean, it's almost like an atomization, but it's this complete disconnection from your actual physical community and people around you is something which you can't really have that in a small village scenario. Like the village life is, I mean, I live in a very small village in the mountains. We know everyone in the village. We help each other out. In general, we all get on. Inevitably, as some people rub up people different ways, but in general, there's, I've got a guy who's borrowing a bunch of my scaffolding right now because he's renovating a barn, and this sort of, it's like real tangible value exchange. And when I lived in a city, it didn't really exist. So I think this small community living can actually make actual communities. I think that's probably the long and short of it. And through community, we can more easily find value. We can more easily help people in need because we can understand what their needs are and we can see where we can contribute. And when we contribute, we feel good.
Nice. So what are some practical steps that people can take to become more self-aware and more open-minded when they are kind of questioning their current ideologies?
That's a good question. So, I mean, firstly, the problem with ideas and ideologies, especially the ones that we grow up in, is they're sort of like a background noise. They're there. That noise is there since we're a baby, and as we grow up into an adult, that noise permeates everything, and it's sometimes hard to see what it is or hear what it is until you somehow turn it off. And I think that's actually genuinely a really hard thing to do. And one thing you can look at potentially is look at your behavior and how you spend your time. Because although we might not really understand our values, or we might feel like we have values, but they're not actually how we spend our time. The bottom line of everything is behavior communicates values. So one of the things we can do is try and understand, okay, there's all the things we say we believe in or we are, but then there's like, actually, what are we spending our time doing? What are we working towards? What do we spend our money on? Who do we associate with, and how do we associate with them? What experiences do we do with other people, and what are those experiences based around, and what is the structure of those things? Yeah. And then through that, we might be able to peel back some of the understanding of like, actually, what are my values? What are the ideas that I'm actually living to compared to the ones that I would like to live to? And then through changing our behavior or directing our life in a different direction or making effort to do something different, then we can actually change our actual values. And through behavior, we're more likely to be able to change how we see things and how we believe or what we believe over time. But it's not an easy process, I would say.
No, it's not. And I do think kind of what I said earlier about like, sometimes tiny house dwellers become minimalists and sometimes minimalists become tiny house dwellers. I think that with these ideological changes, I would imagine that taking the kind of radical step of maybe deciding to do van life for a couple of years or live in a tiny house or take on a big project like DIYing something, that can kind of accelerate those ideological changes just out of necessity, just because the experience or that the experience will just change you and you don't have to necessarily be so in your head about it. You don't have to think about the change. It just kind of happens because of the setting or because of your experiences.
I think you're right. I think what action does is it takes away the buts, like, oh, I'd like to do that, but, I need an extra room in my house or whatever. I'd like to do that, but, what will my friends think of me? Or I'd like, there's for anything that we want to do or we think might be better, even if it's just like a purely rational thing, we're not really very rational. We mostly base our behaviors on what we feel. But even if you're like, okay, I've got this crushing mortgage debt, I'm working all the time to pay that thing, and my bills are really high because I've got this enormous space to heat, but if I had this tiny house, actually, I could be like mortgage free in like 2 years, and I'm free from that. Yeah, maybe eventually down the road, you build up some equity, you build up some wealth, and you buy a house again. Yeah. But it is a stopgap or a way just to get out of the rut of being stuck in it. That's a really logical decision. But then you have the buts. Oh, but I'd like this thing, and how if all my friends want to come to say what would happen, and these things. If you just go for it, and then you find out, oh, it's fine. That pops the bubble of like all the perceived needs we had before. I moved in a van, I was traveling climbing, and I had like one solar panel, and it was all the power I needed. And I'm traveling, and I'm having a great time. Costs very little. My life traveling in the van is unbelievably cheap compared to renting an apartment in London, having all the bills, and all the associated costs of city living. And it really opened. Well, I mean, I knew before how cheap you could live, but then when you actually do that, you're like, this is really cool. If I ever have any like financial problem in my life, I could just build a van, boom, I'm done. I'm living cheap.
Yeah. It's like a quick way out.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah. So you make some predictions in the ideas that rule us. One of which is a kind of a shift towards, digital nomadism. And we've seen it happen. I think COVID really accelerated the remote work trend, but does it go beyond just remote work? What do you see as the future of kind of living? Is it going to be as sedentary as it was?
Well, I guess it depends. Well, it depends on where people are living. I mean, I think one thing we can see is wherever you have high-speed internet, and I'm in the mountains here, we have fiber. It's actually about 8 times faster than the internet. So my brother has in the central London.
Wow.
You can live here and you can work here. For example, my wife, she's set up she started a biotech company from this little village in the mountains. She's got a lab now working in near London. She's raised 2 million pre-seed, and she's been able to do all of that from here, this like mountain environment.
Yeah.
There's like a tiny village, 18 people, in rural Catalonia.
Yeah.
And so I think these things show that there's the opportunities exist now to do quite serious stuff. But like, you don't have to be in London or the Bay Area. It makes a huge difference, just the culture shift towards accepting Zoom calls and things. So if you can do that, if you can start a biotech company from scratch from the mountains and still be based in the mountains, you can pretty much do anything as long as you've got a decently fast internet connection. And I think over time, people realizing that, and they can realize that there are different opportunities to live different places and have different life experiences. For example, you mentioned sort of having a sedentary lifestyle. Now, if you're in the city, then your two options are you go for a run, which can be like, running along the road with diesel fumes around and around the same park, or you've got the option of going to a gym, which I don't know, that never really inspired me. There are obviously other forms of exercise, but when you live in the countryside, I can just go out, I can hike up a mountain, I can go and work on some development for climbing crags. I can do. It's very easy to access like high quality relaxation, and I think that's something which, when people realize or they're able to access that, they can have, they can do serious work and then very quickly have high quality rest, essentially, in beautiful places, in nature. My wife, she's got a garden, she loves gardening, and like in 1 minute she's in the garden with her hands in the soil, and it's affordable because it's not in central of a big city. So I think that possibility is going to become more attractive with people over time, and it's going to spread out where people can live in relation to cities. People, if you only have to travel into the city to be at your office 1 or 2 days a week, you can accept a longer commute potentially, and you can live somewhere a little bit more remote. So I think there's going to be a general shift over time towards that, but probably it's going to be slow, because it's a lot to change. There's a lot for people to change their habits, change what they feel, and realize that. So, but it will take time.
Yeah. Well, in our last interview, we touched on the idea that tiny houses don't appreciate in value in the same way that vans do. And, that whole idea of like, oh, is this an asset that's appreciating or depreciating is a very capitalistic kind of ideology. And I know you said you're not anti-capitalist, clearly. And, but I'm curious, based on your, based on the ideas that rule us, what's your current thinking on, how much should somebody care, whether a tiny house appreciates or depreciates, or a van appreciates or depreciates?
Well, I mean, a van is going to depreciate. It's definitely a depreciated asset. There's nothing you get around it. You put loads of miles on it, and eventually it breaks down. A tiny house, however, I didn't see how that should be any different than another house. As long as you maintain it, there's always a cost to have a house, to keep it in good order. You always have to maintain it. That's just a fact of life. There's so many moving parts in a house, so to say. But I think like the way I see, and I wrote about this at length in the book about the property, like cost of property, which in a lot of Western countries, it's just completely insane. It's a piece of absolute collective insanity to have allowed property prices to get to this point. It makes no sense. Harms basically everyone, apart from people who own lots of properties or banks who can, get interest for more years out of more people. So I think my perspective on housing, it should really, ideally, houses aren't seen to be like the most important investment vehicle of your life. Ideally, a house is somewhere you live, and it's a tool for you to live your life. It shouldn't be this most scary financial choice you make in your life, because if you get it wrong, then it's a disaster. Or you shouldn't be sitting in your house expecting that it's going to go up like 10% a year. I mean, it's obviously unsustainable. Aside from that, it's just not good. It's not a good way for us collectively to live. When I bought this house in Catalonia, some people said to me, "Oh, like, well, I think you overpaid on that." And actually, because I bought a ruin, it was already cheap. And like whether it's 10,000 one way or another because I saw it as a long-term thing.
Yeah.
I didn't care. And then I put whatever money into the house I needed to build it, to have good systems. And I saved obviously a lot of money by building it myself, but I just put in the good system. So I'm like, well, I want to have a really good house. I want to be efficient. I want to be environmentally friendly. I want to have it like cheap to run, good solar systems. And that's it. And I didn't really plan on selling it. That was never the aim. I'm not flipping it. It's not an investment. It's like, it's a way to live somewhere beautiful and have a relatively cheap house and get that debt got rid of as fast as possible. And that's done. So I've got this, it's incredible, like very low cost of living. If things change up and down with my business, which does happen over time, it doesn't bother me so much. I can just, I'm not stressing about it. No, where's my money gone? I need to earn, I need to graft. So I can just look at it in a very calm way and be like, oh, I made less money this month, which essentially just means I save less money. But it's not stressing me because life costs are so low.
Nice.
So again, it's like coming back, houses shouldn't be investment. It should be a tool. And the tool should be to live the life you want in the way that you want to live. And ideally, in my perspective, it fosters some sense of freedom and doesn't tie you to some massive financial burden for the next 35 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of these ideas, will resonate for people who are interested in tiny house living or van life or, any of these kind of alternative, smaller living footprints. The book is called The Ideas That Rule Us. Is it currently out now or is it coming out?
It's out now in basically all the bookshops.
Okay.
If you're looking for it, this is how it looks. The Ideas That Rule Us.
Nice.
And you can get Amazon, Barnes and Noble, pretty much all of them, all the ebook sites as well.
Awesome.
So ebook, and there's an audiobook coming soon.
Excellent. Read by the author?
Sorry?
Read by the author?
Oh, unfortunately, no. It's so much work to make an audiobook.
Yes.
I just don't think I can make my voice the same for that period of time. I didn't exactly know how people do it. And anytime I've done like B-roll or voiceover for videos, if I didn't film all in one session, the next day I sound totally different. So I just figured I've got so much to do with the book and the promotion. I just outsourced it.
Nice. Well, I will put links to the Ideas That Rule Us on the show notes for this episode, which will be episode 303, I believe. So thetinyhouse.net/303. Nate Murphy, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Ethan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Nate Murphy for being a guest on the show today. You can find the show notes for this episode, including a complete transcript and links and resources at thetinyhouse.net/303. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/303. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast so you never miss an update. And if our conversation resonated with you, please share it with your friends and community. Your support helps us continue to bring inspiring and insightful content to listeners like you. Also, thank you so much to Precision Temp for being a sponsor of the show. We really appreciate Precision Temp, and I hope you check out their hot water heaters. They really are the best in the business. One programming note, the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast will be taking August off. So if you're listening to this in August of 2024, I will see you in September. I hope you have a great summer and talk to you soon.